I need to tell you about something that happened to me when I was 13 years old, something that changed the entire course of my life and taught me about a prayer so powerful that it's opened doors I never even knew existed. My name is Samuel Crawford, and back in 1887, my family had a small homestead about 40 miles west of what would later become Oklahoma City. It wasn't much. Just a wooden cabin my father built with his own hands, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and about 60 acres of prairie land that we'd managed to clear and plant with corn and wheat. My mother, God rest her soul, had died giving birth to my little sister Emma 2 years prior, so it was just me, my father Jacob, Emma, and our neighbor's widow, Mrs. Henderson, who helped care for Emma when Pa and I were working the fields. Life was hard out there on the frontier, but we made do. We had to. There wasn't any other choice. Every morning before dawn, Pa would wake me with a gentle shake of my shoulder, and we'd head out to tend the livestock before the sun came up. The work was backbreaking, but there was something honest about it, something that made a man feel like he was earning his place in this world through the sweat of his brow and the strength of his back. But that autumn, everything started falling apart like a house of cards in a windstorm. It began with the wheat. A disease swept through our crops, turning the golden stalks black and brittle. Within a week we lost nearly 3/4 of our harvest. Pa stood in that field, his weathered hands running through what remained of our livelihood, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Despair, pure, unadulterated despair. "Samuel," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the prairie wind, "I don't know how we're gonna make it through the winter. The banknote was due in November, and without the wheat harvest we had no way to pay it. Miss Garrison at the First National Bank had been patient with us after Ma died, but his patience was wearing thin. He'd made that clear during his last visit, when he sat at our kitchen table, his cold gray eyes calculating the value of everything we owned. "Jacob," he'd said, "I've got investors breathing down my neck. They want to develop this land, build something modern here. If you can't make your payment, I'm afraid I'll have no choice but to foreclose." 3 weeks later, the corn got hit by an early frost. Everything we'd worked for, everything we'd built was slipping away like water through our fingers. But it was Mrs. Henderson who saved us, though we didn't realize it at first. She came over that evening after we'd lost the corn, carrying a pot of stew and wearing that patient smile she always had when life got particularly difficult. Mrs. Henderson was a woman who'd seen her share of hardship, lost her husband to consumption the year before, raised 4 children on her own, but she had this way about her, this quiet strength that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside. "Jacob," she said, setting the pot on our table, "I want to tell you about something that might help." Pa looked up from where he sat with his head in his hands. "Unless you've got $300 hidden in that stew pot, Martha, I don't think anything's gonna help us now." She pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, her eyes serious but kind. "What I've got is better than money, though I know that's hard to believe right now. I want to tell you about a prayer." Now, my father was a religious man, don't get me wrong. We attended church services when the circuit preacher came through town, and Pa made sure I knew my Bible verses. But when Mrs. Henderson started talking about this prayer, something in her voice was different. There was a certainty there, a conviction that went beyond ordinary faith. "My grandmother taught me this prayer when I was about Samuel's age," she continued, glancing over at me where I sat by the fire. "She learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. It goes back generations, passed down from one woman to the next, always in times of great need." Pa leaned back in his chair, skeptical but willing to listen. "What kind of prayer are we talking about, Martha?" Mrs. Henderson reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. The edges were yellowed with age, and the writing on it was so faded I could barely make out the words from where I sat. "This prayer," she said, unfolding the paper carefully, "is meant to open doors, all kinds of doors. Doors to opportunity, to provision, to hope when hope seems lost. But it's not magic, Jacob. It's not some kind of trick or superstition. It's about aligning your heart with something bigger than yourself, about opening yourself up to possibilities you might not have considered." She looked down at the paper, her lips moving silently as she read the words to herself. Then she looked back up at my father, and I saw something pass between them, an understanding maybe, or just a recognition that sometimes when you're drowning you'll grab onto any rope that's thrown your way. "The prayer goes like this," Miss Henderson said, and her voice took on a different quality, almost like she was reciting something sacred. "Divine source of all abundance and mercy, I come before you with an open heart and a willing spirit. I acknowledge that you are the creator of every opportunity, the opener of every door, and the provider of every blessing. Today I align my will with yours, my desires with your greater purpose, my fears with your perfect love. I ask not for what I think I need, but for what you know I require for my highest good and the good of all those I love. Open the doors that should be opened, close the doors that should remain closed, and give me the wisdom to know the difference. Guide my steps toward the path you have prepared for me and help me to trust in your timing even when I cannot see the way forward. I surrender my worries, my plans, and my desperate attempts to control what is beyond my control. In their place I accept your grace, your guidance, and your abundance in whatever form it chooses to manifest. I pray this prayer with complete faith, knowing that you hear me, that you love me, and that you will provide for me and my family according to your perfect will. Amen. The silence that followed was profound. Outside I could hear the wind moving through the prairie grass, the distant lowing of cattle, and the creak of our barn settling for the night. But inside our cabin it felt like the very air had changed, become somehow thicker, more charged with possibility. You say this prayer 3 times every day, Mrs. Henderson continued, morning, afternoon, and evening. You say it with complete faith, not because you're trying to manipulate God or the universe into giving you what you want, but because you're opening yourself up to receive what's already there waiting for you to notice it. Pa was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over in his mind. Finally he spoke. Martha, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not sure how a prayer is gonna pay off our banknote or put food on our table. Mrs. Henderson smiled, that patient, knowing smile of hers. Jacob, let me tell you what happened to me when I started saying this prayer. She settled back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, and began to tell us a story that would stay with me for the rest of my life. When my Thomas died, she said, I was left with 4 children, no money, and a farm I couldn't manage on my own. The bank was threatening to foreclose, just like they are with you. My oldest boy, Michael, was only 14, too young to take on the kind of responsibility that was facing us. I was at my wit's end, ready to pack up the children and move back east to live with my sister in Pennsylvania. She paused, looking into the fire that crackled in our hearth. That's when my neighbor, old Mrs. Kowalski, came to see me. She was a Polish immigrant, must have been 80 years old if she was a day, and she'd lived through more hardship than anyone should have to endure. She sat right where I'm sitting now and told me about this prayer, the same prayer I just shared with you. Mrs. Henderson looked directly at my father. I was skeptical too, Jacob, but I was also desperate. So I started saying the prayer 3 times a day, just like she told me to. And I'll be honest with you, nothing happened at first. For 2 weeks I said that prayer faithfully, and our situation seemed to be getting worse, not better. She leaned forward, her eyes intense, but then on the 15th day, something extraordinary happened. A man came to my door, a stranger I'd never seen before. He said he was a cattle buyer from Kansas City, and he'd heard I might be willing to sell some livestock. Now, Jacob, I only had 6 head of cattle left and they weren't in the best condition. But this man, he looked at those cattle like they were prize stock. Mrs. Henderson shook her head, still amazed by the memory. He offered me twice what I thought they were worth, said he was looking for breeding stock and that my cattle had exactly the bloodline he needed. I sold them to him on the spot, and the money was enough to pay off the bank and keep us going through the winter. That could have been just coincidence, Pa said, though I could hear the hope creeping into his voice. That's what I thought too, Mrs. Henderson replied. But it was just the beginning. 2 days later, Michael found a job working for the railroad. They were extending the line through our county, and they needed local boys who knew the terrain. The pay was better than anything available in town. A week after that, I got a letter from my cousin in Missouri, asking if I'd be willing to take in her oldest daughter as a hired girl. She'd pay me monthly, and the girl would help with the household work. Mrs. Henderson spread her hands. One thing led to another. Doors kept opening, opportunities kept presenting themselves. Within 6 months, we were not only stable but actually prospering. Michael got promoted to assistant crew chief with the railroad.